Let's take a look at this first problem. As I'm reading the question, I'm going to be circling and boxing and underlining the most important parts of our question. So in this question it says, Mr. Zortman started reading a book at 3:45 p.m. He stopped reading his book at 5:45 p.m. How long did Mr. Zortman read a book for? In this paragraph, we're being asked for a period of time. How long did Mr. Zortman read? So I'm going to show you using a strategy that you'll be using in 4th grade, using a table. So we're going to think about the start time. We're going to think about the end time. And we're going to think about the time that passed. I like to call this my set table just because it says this is my start, my end, and then the time that it took for the activity. So looking back at my question, I have Mr. Zortman started reading a book at 3:45. So we know our start time is 3:45. I go to my next sentence. He stopped reading the book at 5:45. So that's my end time, 5:45. So I'm thinking, how much time is between 3:45 and 5:45? Now, sometimes we can get a little confused because we think that we have to do something with these minutes. But if you look, the minutes are the same, 45 and 45. So really, I only need to go from the hour of 3 to the hour of 5. So how do I get from 3 to 5? Well, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So that means I have 2 hours. So Mr. Zortman read his book for 2 hours because there's 2 hours between 3:45 and 5:45. Okay, let's again read the question and look for the most important parts. Mrs. Bradford and her daughters went to the zoo. They arrived at 1:15 p.m. They stayed at the zoo for 3 hours. What time did they leave the zoo? I'm going to go back and reread and look for my actions again. So Mrs. Bradford and her daughters went to the zoo. Okay, it's interesting enough sentence, but not a sentence I necessarily need anything from. They arrived at 1:15 p.m. They stayed at the zoo for 3 hours. What time did they leave? So I know that I'm looking for a leaving time, which means it's going to be after all the rest of the times. So if I set up my table, I'm looking for a start time, an end time, and then the time that was spent doing whatever activity. We know they arrived or they got there at 1:15. We're looking for the time that they left, so we don't know that yet. And we know that they stayed at the zoo for 3 hours. So if they started at 1:15, we need to add 3 hours on there. So I would say 1:15 to 2:15, 2:15 to 3:15, 3:15 to 4:15. So that means that they left the zoo at 4:15. Here's my last type of question. Let's read it and see what's a little bit different about this one. I'm going to be underlining and circling as I'm finding my numbers and my important words. Mrs. Brown finished cooking dinner at 6:30 p.m. She started cooking dinner 2 hours earlier. What time did Mrs. Brown start cooking dinner? So let's reread and try to find some meaning. Mrs. Brown finished cooking dinner at 6:30 p.m. If I finished then, that must be my latest time. That's when I ended cooking. So my end time is 6:30. She started cooking 2 hours earlier. 2 hours earlier from 6:30. So the time that I spent cooking dinner was 2 hours. I hope it was really good if I spent 2 hours on it. What time did Mrs. Brown start cooking dinner? Well, I know this has to be a time earlier than 6:30 because that's when I finished cooking and I spent 2 hours on it. So I need to do 2 hours before 6:30. Well, 1 hour before 6:30 is 5:30, so 2 hours would be 4:30.